I didn't plan to stay long, and that's what makes the memory sting so sharply. Because how threatening can a mother be when she only wants to say hello? When she carries nothing but fruit still warm from the sun and a hope she knows better than to trust, yet trusts anyway. Because that's what mothers do when silence stretches too long and birthdays pass without calls, and you tell yourself that success must be loud and busy and not personal, not intentional, so you take a bus across town, then another. Then walk the last stretch toward a neighborhood that looks like it belongs to a different country altogether, where the houses don't lean with age and the sidewalks don't crack, where everything gleams as if it were freshly unwrapped. And all the way there, you rehearse what you'll say, nothing dramatic, nothing that asks for anything, just hello, just I was nearby. Just I brought oranges because you used to love them peeled in one long ribbon and eaten in quiet concentration as if it were a ritual you invented together. And you tell yourself that memory is a bridge, that it has weight, that it still holds, even when years have taught you to walk carefully, even when success has taught your child to forget where she came from. And you don't knock at first because there's a gate and a camera and a long driveway that makes you feel like you've already crossed a line. But the gate opens anyway, and you walk, slow and small, clutching the bag like a peace offering. Like proof you're not here to ask for money or forgiveness or a place at the table. Just a minute, just her face, just confirmation that the girl you raised still exists somewhere beneath the polish. And when you reach the door, you hesitate. Because hesitation has kept you alive for decades. Because you learned early that timing can decide whether love is welcomed or punished. But before you can change your mind, the door opens and the world shifts in a way you can't quite name. Because the woman standing there looks like your daughter only in the most technical sense, the bone structure, the familiar eyes sharpened by something colder, something practiced, and for a heartbeat there's fear on her face, not surprise, not joy. But fear as if you've walked in on a crime scene, as if your presence alone threatens to unravel something carefully constructed. And then the fear hardens, snaps into control, and she asks why you're here, not in the way a child asks, but in the way a lawyer does, clipped and urgent, as if every second you stand there is another second the wrong person might see you. And you try to answer, you really do, you try to say the rehearsed nothing, the harmless words. But she doesn't wait, she glances behind her, lowers her voice, and tells you that you should have called, that this isn't a good time, that there are people inside who don't need to see you, and the word need lands strangely. Because when did a mother become optional? When did her presence become something to manage? And before you can understand the shift, she says it, the word that rearranges everything, the word that turns your careful offering into a threat. The word she uses like it explains everything. Liability, and it's said so easily, so cleanly, as if she's been practicing it, as if she's had to convince herself of it long before you ever stood on that doorstep. And in that moment, you realize she's not embarrassed of you. She's afraid of what you represent, afraid that your existence contradicts a story she's been telling so convincingly that even she believes it. And the pain isn't loud, it's surgical. It slices through memory after memory. The nights you worked until your hands burned, the mornings you packed lunches from scraps, the promises you made and kept without witnesses. And you stand there holding the bag steady. Because steadiness has always been your armor, and you think maybe this is the worst of it. Maybe words are all she has, but then her hand comes out, flat and firm, not a slap, not dramatic enough for remorse. Just a shove meant to move an object out of the way, and you stumble because the steps are smooth and you weren't braced for it. And the bag tears and the oranges scatter, rolling like punctuation marks across the ground, splitting open, staining the stone with their sweetness, and you fall hard enough to feel it later but not hard enough to make a scene. And that seems important to her, because she doesn't look at you, not really, she looks past you, toward the inside. Toward the life that requires you to be invisible, and she laughs, a small, dismissive sound that tells you this moment will not be acknowledged again, and the door closes, and you hear her voice change instantly, bright and effortless. A voice you recognize from interviews and stages, a voice that tells a different story than the one you lived, and you sit there for a second longer than you should, because standing up feels like admitting something has ended. And when you do stand, you leave the fruit where it is, because picking it up would feel like begging, and you walk away with your back straight and your mouth closed and your heart doing something strange, something quiet and heavy. Because somewhere between the gate and the sidewalk, you understand that what just happened wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a decision made long ago, and you were only just informed. And as you reach the street, you think the worst part is over, that the door is closed and that's that, but you're wrong, because you don't yet know that the door will open again, and when it does, it won't be for you. I wish I could tell you I walked away cleanly, that I didn't look back, that dignity carried me like armor down the street, but the truth is more complicated. Because when a door closes on you like that, it doesn't just shut out the present, it reaches backward and rattles every memory you ever relied on. And as I reached the sidewalk, my legs slowed on their own. Not from weakness, but from disbelief, because some part of me still expected the world to correct itself, to tap me on the shoulder and say there had been a misunderstanding, that this wasn't how stories like ours were supposed to turn out. And I was still standing there, pretending to examine a crack in the pavement, when I heard it, the soft click of the handle behind me, the sound of a door reconsidering, and my chest tightened because hope is a reflex you never fully unlearn, even when it's punished again and again. So I shifted slightly, not enough to be seen, just enough to watch, and the door opened not wide but politely, the way doors do when they're about to perform. And out stepped a woman I had never met but somehow already knew, because she wore the kind of kindness that photographs well, white hair arranged just so, a shawl that suggested warmth without inconvenience, pearl earrings that caught the light in a way that made her seem gentle by default, and she held my daughter's hand as if that had always been her place, as if the years had simply corrected themselves while I wasn't looking. And my daughter's posture changed the instant she crossed the threshold, her shoulders softening, her face opening into something practiced and believable, and when she spoke, it was not with panic or irritation but with pride, introducing the woman beside her to the small cluster of people waiting just inside, reporters and guests and faces trained to recognize inspiration when it's presented properly, and I heard the words before I understood them. Heard my daughter say, "my mother," with a reverence she had never used for me, and the world tilted in a way that made my vision blur, because there are many kinds of loss, but replacement is the one that erases you while you're still breathing. And as the cameras lifted and the questions began, I realized with a clarity that felt almost calm that this was not improvisation. This was choreography, and every line she spoke had been rehearsed, every pause calibrated. The story flowing smoothly from hardship to triumph, a story in which she had been alone, in which the woman beside her had rescued her from emptiness, had believed when no one else did, had sacrificed in ways that made good copy. And the crowd reacted exactly as it was meant to. Murmurs of sympathy, nods of approval, a few wiped eyes, and I stood just outside the frame, close enough to hear my life being retold with better lighting and softer edges. Close enough to recognize my own sacrifices repackaged as someone else's virtues, and the strangest thing was not the anger. I would have welcomed anger, but the quiet understanding that this was why she had pushed me. Why my presence had caused fear instead of embarrassment, because I wasn't just inconvenient, I was evidence, and evidence ruins narratives, and as the woman spoke again, her voice trembling at the right moments, I noticed the way her hands shook not with grief but with effort, the effort of holding a roll steady under scrutiny, and for a fleeting second our eyes met, just briefly, and in that glance there was no triumph, no malice. Only something hollow and familiar, a look I had seen in the mirror on nights when exhaustion stripped away pretense, and in that instant I understood that this woman was not my enemy, she was my replacement, and those are not the same thing. Because enemies want to defeat you, but replacements simply require you not to exist. And as the door closed again and applause drifted through the glass like muffled weather, I stepped back fully this time. Because staying would have meant witnessing the rest of it, the hugs, the laughter, the toasts to resilience, and I didn't want my last memory of my daughter to be applause that wasn't meant for me. So I walked until the street widened and the houses shrank and the air felt less curated, and only then did the pain arrive properly, not as a wave but as a pressure, the kind that makes breathing feel optional. And I sat on a bench at a bus stop and watched ordinary life continue around me, children tugging at sleeves, couples arguing about groceries, a woman laughing too loudly into her phone, and it struck me how unremarkable erasure looks from the outside, how easily a life can be edited out while the rest of the world keeps moving. And when the bus came, I didn't get on. Because going home felt too final, because part of me was still rearranging the moment, still searching for the version of events where I said something different, stood differently, arrived at a better time. And it wasn't until I turned on the television hours later and saw her there, seated comfortably on a bright set beside the same woman, the caption beneath them celebrating the power of a mother's love, that the last piece fell into place. Because this wasn't just about shame or ambition, this was commerce. This was a story that paid dividends, and I had never fit the brand, not with my rough hands and unpolished grief. And as the host leaned forward and asked about reunion and healing and forgiveness, my daughter answered with practiced sincerity, speaking of finding family after years of emptiness, of being guided by a love she didn't earn. And I realized then that my absence was not a lie she told reluctantly, it was a product she sold enthusiastically, and that knowledge settled in me with a strange steadiness, because pain without purpose exhausts you. But pain that reveals intent sharpens you, and as I sat alone in the quiet glow of the screen, watching a stranger receive credit for a life I had lived, I felt something shift from hurt to resolve. Because being called a liability had taught me something important. Liabilities are removed quietly and efficiently, and that meant there was more to uncover than a shove and a closed door, more beneath the surface than I had been allowed to see, and as I turned off the television and the room went dark, one thought anchored itself in my mind, heavy and insistent, the kind of thought that doesn't leave once it arrives, that if my story had been replaced so easily, then it must have been rewritten carefully, and careful lies always leave fingerprints. There's a particular kind of shock that doesn't explode but settles, the kind that sits quietly in your chest and changes the way you observe everything afterward, and that's what followed me in the days after I saw her on television. Because once you realize someone has replaced you, you start noticing the seams, the places where the story doesn't quite fit, and suddenly every interview, every article, every carefully edited photograph feels like a window you're finally allowed to look through from the outside. And I began to watch not as a mother hoping to recognize her child, but as a witness searching for truth. And what I saw unsettled me more than the shove ever had, because the woman they called her mother was everywhere now, at fundraisers, seated in the front row at conferences, standing beside her in glossy, magazine spreads with her head tilted just enough to suggest humility, always dressed in soft colors that spoke of comfort and forgiveness, and the public loved her instantly. Because the world is always ready to adore a gentle face attached to a redemptive narrative, and each time I saw them together, smiling in unison, touching hands at just the right moments, I felt the strange dislocation of watching my own memories performed better than I had ever been able to live them, because this woman never looked tired, never seemed worn down by years of scarcity, never carried the quiet edge of survival that clings to those who have had to choose between rent and groceries, and yet she spoke my lines with confidence, telling stories of sacrifice and belief as if she had been there for the long nights and the hard choices. And what hurt most was not that people believed her, but that they wanted to, because she made motherhood look palatable, inspirational, something you could applaud without discomfort. And that was when it became clear that I had not just been erased, I had been edited out for tone, replaced with a version that tested better with audiences. And once that thought lodged itself in my mind, I couldn't unsee it, couldn't stop noticing how every hardship was softened, every struggle reframed into something motivational instead of messy. And I began to understand why my daughter had panicked when she saw me on the doorstep, because I didn't fit the aesthetic. I carried too much reality, too many sharp edges that couldn't be smoothed without breaking the illusion. And one afternoon, scrolling through an article that praised her resilience and the miraculous reunion that had inspired her company's mission, I felt something inside me go very still, because there it was in print, a timeline that made no sense. References to years that contradicted each other, claims of foster care placements that never happened. Details that anyone who had actually lived that life would have known not to invent so carelessly. And I realized then that the story wasn't just false, it was rushed, assembled quickly because success had accelerated everything. Because there hadn't been time to build a lie slowly and carefully, and that realization brought with it an unexpected calm, because sloppy lies betray urgency, and urgency suggests fear, and fear means there is something to protect. And as I kept watching, kept reading, kept listening, I noticed the woman beside her more closely, the way she deferred just a second too late, the way her eyes sometimes flicked toward my daughter before answering, as if checking for approval, the way she never corrected anything, never added personal detail beyond what was necessary to reinforce the narrative. And it occurred to me that this woman wasn't just playing a role, she was being directed. And that raised a question I hadn't yet allowed myself to ask. Who was she when the cameras were off? Who benefits from pretending to be someone else's mother? And why would anyone agree to carry another woman's history like borrowed jewelry? And that question stayed with me through sleepless nights and quiet mornings, through moments when grief threatened to pull me backward into self-pity, because curiosity, I discovered, is a powerful antidote to despair. And instead of asking why this had happened to me, I began asking how it had been done. And once you shift from emotion to observation, patterns emerge, and I started to see the repetition. The way the same phrases appeared in different interviews, the same anecdotes recycled with minor adjustments, the way the woman's background remained conveniently vague. Always just enough detail to seem authentic without ever becoming verifiable, and the more I noticed, the more something else surfaced, something uncomfortable but undeniable. This was not a spontaneous lie, it was a constructed partnership, a mutually beneficial arrangement built on absence and longing, and that realization reframed everything. Because it meant my daughter hadn't just replaced me out of cruelty or shame, she had outsourced motherhood, selected a version that served her brand, and that choice, cold as it was, revealed a level of calculation I had never associated with the child I raised, and that was the moment grief gave way to clarity, because you can mourn a loss endlessly, but once you recognize intent, you're forced to respond differently. And as I sat there one evening, watching another clip of them hugging under soft lights while an audience applauded their bond, I felt the final thread of denial snap. Because the truth was no longer just painful, it was instructive, and it taught me that I was not dealing with a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation or forgiveness. I was dealing with a narrative that needed to be protected at all costs, and narratives like that don't collapse under emotion, they collapse under evidence, and as that thought settled in, steady and deliberate, I understood that my role in this story had changed, that I was no longer the unwanted visitor or the grieving mother watching from the margins. I was the variable they hadn't accounted for. The original source material they assumed would stay silent, and silence, I realized, is only powerful when it's chosen, not when it's enforced. And for the first time since the door had closed on me, I felt something like direction. Because if my life had been rewritten so convincingly, then somewhere beneath the polish there had to be proof of the draft they tried to destroy, and I didn't yet know where to find it or how much it would cost. But I knew this much with absolute certainty. Stories built on borrowed memories always leave traces, and I was ready to start looking for them. The moment you decide you're no longer searching for comfort but for clarity, everything changes, because pain asks you to sit still while proof demands movement, and I had spent enough nights sitting in the quiet, replaying the same scenes until they lost their edges, so I began to move instead, slowly and deliberately, not in anger but with purpose, because purpose steadies the hands when emotion would only make them shake. And I understood early on that confronting her directly would achieve nothing, that asking for explanations would only give her space to polish the lie further, so I chose a different path, one built on distance and patience. The kind of patience you learn when you've waited years for things to get better without anyone noticing. And I started where stories live now, not in living rooms or letters, but in public records, online traces. Patterns left behind by people who assume no one is looking closely. And I read everything, every interview transcript, every profile, every foundation report, not searching for outrage but for inconsistency. Because truth doesn't shout, it aligns, and lies, no matter how beautifully told, always slip out of formation somewhere. And at first it felt futile, like trying to reconstruct a life from shadows. Because the narrative had been scrubbed clean, references to early years simplified, details blurred into inspirational shorthand. But then I noticed something small and strangely comforting. Repetition, the same phrases surfacing again and again, the same emotional beats hit with mechanical precision. And repetition, I learned, is not authenticity, it's rehearsal, and that realization gave me my first quiet victory. Because it meant the story was not evolving, it was being maintained, and maintenance requires effort, and effort leaves marks. And as I followed those marks, I began to notice what was missing, entire chapters glossed over. Years condensed into a single sentence, relationships mentioned without names, places without addresses, and the more I noticed the gaps, the more I understood their function, because gaps are where questions hide, and questions are dangerous. And one evening, after hours spent cross-checking timelines that didn't quite line up, I reached a conclusion that surprised even me. The woman presented as her mother did not exist in any of the places she claimed to have lived. Not as a parent, not as a guardian, not as anything more than a figure who appeared suddenly, fully formed. At the precise moment, my daughter's story needed a moral anchor, and that alone would not have been enough to move me forward, because suspicion without confirmation is just another kind of suffering. But it pushed me to consider something I had resisted until then, that if the truth was going to surface, it wouldn't come from screens or articles, it would come from people, from human systems that don't care about branding or inspiration. Systems that record facts without sentiment. And so I made a decision that felt both heavy and inevitable, the kind you know you'll remember making long after everything else blurs. And I reached out to someone who made a living looking where others preferred not to, a man whose name came to me through a chain of quiet recommendations, always spoken with a pause beforehand, as if acknowledging the seriousness of what was about to follow. And when he finally sat across from me at my kitchen table, his posture calm and unassuming, I felt the strange relief that comes when you hand a burden to someone trained to carry it. And I told him nothing dramatic, no speeches, no accusations, just the facts as I knew them, the timeline as I lived it. The public story as it was being told now, and I watched his face not for sympathy but for interest, because interest would mean there was something to find, and after a long silence he nodded once. The way people do when they see a path opening, and he said quietly that stories like this often unravel faster than expected, not because they're poorly told, but because they rely on too many people pretending at once, and pretense, he reminded me, is exhausting, and in the weeks that followed, I learned the discipline of waiting again. But this time, waiting felt different because it was active, filled with updates that arrived without emotion. Emails that contained facts instead of opinions, dates instead of adjectives. And as the picture began to take shape, it did so not with drama but with precision, revealing a past that did not match the softness on screen. A life marked by instability and loss that had been selectively rewritten into something noble and marketable. And the more I learned, the more the anger I expected to feel refused to arrive, replaced instead by something colder and clearer. Because the woman who had replaced me was not who she claimed to be, not a savior, not a long-lost parent, but someone who had learned how to survive by becoming whatever the moment required. And that realization complicated everything, because villains are easy to hate, but survivors wearing borrowed roles are harder to judge. And as this truth settled in, I found myself less interested in punishment and more focused on exposure. Because exposure does not require cruelty, only light, and light has a way of revealing not just wrongdoing but vulnerability. And one afternoon, as I studied a photograph my investigator had sent, a candid image taken far from stages and cameras, the woman seated alone, makeup half removed. Her expression unguarded and distant, I felt an unexpected recognition because there was something in her eyes I knew well, the look of someone waiting to be seen without knowing how to ask, and that recognition didn't weaken my resolve. It sharpened it because it clarified where responsibility truly lay, and as I stared at that image, understanding settling into something solid and unmovable, I realized the next step would not be public or loud, it would be personal. Because before stories collapse in the open, they often fracture in private. And I knew then that if I wanted the truth to surface intact, I would have to face the woman who wore my name not as an enemy, but as someone standing in the wrong place for reasons she believed were necessary. And that knowledge carried its own weight, heavy and unavoidable, because it meant the next chapter would not be about revenge or revelation, but about confrontation of a quieter, more dangerous kind, the kind that forces everyone involved to see themselves clearly. And as that realization took hold, I understood that the most important meeting of this entire story was about to happen, and it would not involve my daughter at all. I had imagined confrontation as something loud, something that demanded witnesses and raised voices, but when the moment finally arrived, it was quiet enough to miss. Unfolding in the ordinary space of a cafe where no one expected truth to sit down unannounced, and that quiet is what made it dangerous, because there's nowhere to hide when no one is watching, and I arrived early. Choosing a table near the window not for drama, but for clarity, because clarity, I'd learned, comes easier when you can see the street and remember that life continues regardless of what you're about to uncover. And when she walked in, I recognized her instantly, not from the magazines or the stages, but from the photograph that had haunted me for days, thinner than she appeared on screen. Shoulders slightly hunched as if she carried weight that didn't belong to her, and when our eyes met, there was no surprise, only resignation, the kind that comes when someone knows the story is about to catch up with them, and she sat without asking. Hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't ordered yet, and said my name carefully, as if testing whether it still belonged to me, And in that moment, every speech I had rehearsed dissolved because anger feels foolish in the face of exhaustion. And what sat across from me was not a villain rehearsing excuses, but a woman bracing for judgment she had already delivered to herself. And I asked the question that mattered most, not accusatory, not sharp, just honest. Why? And she looked down, then out the window, then back at me, as if aligning herself with gravity before speaking, and she told me about her life in fragments, about loss that didn't make headlines, about a child she had buried quietly years ago, about the hollow years that followed when being called anything at all felt better than being forgotten. And as she spoke, I felt the edges of my anger dull. Not because what she had done was right, but because I understood the hunger that drives people to step into lives that aren't theirs. The same hunger that once drove me to work until my body felt like it belonged to someone else. And when she admitted that my daughter had approached her with the idea, had offered structure and safety and a role that came with applause, I felt something settle into place because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This wasn't theft, it was transaction, a business arrangement disguised as healing, and the most unsettling part was how reasonable it had sounded to both of them at the time. Because desperation has a way of making ethical lines appear flexible, and as she spoke about rehearsals and talking points and the unspoken rules of when to speak and when to remain silent, I realized how carefully the illusion had been managed, how much effort it took to maintain a lie at that scale, and how unsustainable it must have felt to live inside someone else's gratitude. And when she finally looked at me again, eyes wet but steady, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for understanding, and understanding, I discovered, is heavier than forgiveness because it requires you to carry complexity without resolving it. And I told her the truth she hadn't expected, that I didn't blame her for wanting to be needed, that I blamed the person who decided love could be outsourced without consequence. And she nodded as if she'd been waiting to hear that distinction, as if it allowed her to place responsibility where it belonged. And when we stood to leave, she reached for my hand, not in apology or performance, but in recognition. And that recognition, brief and unrecorded, felt more honest than any embrace I had seen on screen. And as she walked away into the afternoon light, smaller than she had arrived, I understood something essential had shifted. Because the lie was no longer intact, it had been punctured quietly, and punctures, unlike explosions, don't announce themselves immediately, they simply begin to leak. And as I sat there alone, watching steam rise from a cup that had long gone cold, I felt a calm resolve settle in, because now I knew not just what had been done, but how, and that knowledge was enough to move forward without bitterness. Because the next step would not require confrontation or confession. Only documentation, and documentation has a patience all its own. And as I left the cafe with the sun warm on my back, one thought anchored itself firmly in my mind, steady and unyielding. The truth no longer belonged to memory or emotion, it belonged to paper and proof, and once proof enters a story, it doesn't ask permission before it speaks. People assume proof arrives with drama, with a revelation so obvious it feels cinematic, but most of the time it waits patiently in places no one thinks to look anymore. Tucked away not because it's dangerous, but because it's ordinary, and that's where I went next, not to courtrooms or newsrooms, but to my own home. To the back bedroom where the light never quite reaches and the air smells faintly of dust and time, because if my life had been erased so easily, then whatever remained of it would be here, in the things I never thought anyone else would need to see. And I pulled the box from beneath the bed slowly, as if speed might startle it, because that box had followed me through decades and moves and nights when sleep never came. A tin container once meant for cookies that had long since become something else entirely. A vault without a lock because I had never imagined anyone would try to steal what was inside, and as I opened it, the sound felt louder than it should have. The creak of metal protesting the return of memory, and there it was, not neatly arranged but layered, like life itself, letters folded and refolded until the creases softened. Scraps of fabric kept not for their beauty but for their meaning, drawings done in crayon that had faded but never lost their intent. And as I lifted each item, I felt the weight of it settle back into my hands, familiar and grounding. Because these were not symbols curated for an audience, they were artifacts of necessity, of love expressed in the only ways available at the time, and for a moment I just sat there, letting the silence hold me. Because grief had taught me to rush past these things, to avoid lingering, but resolve asked me to look closely, to see them not as comfort but as evidence, and that shift mattered because evidence demands clarity. And clarity demands restraint, and so I began documenting carefully and methodically, photographing each piece under natural light, not editing, not enhancing, just capturing what existed exactly as it was. The handwriting uneven but unmistakable, the dates aligning with years that had been erased from public timelines, the small details no one would bother to fake because they were too specific to be impressive. And as I worked, I felt something unexpected rise. Not anger, not sorrow, but a steady confidence, because lies require invention while truth only requires preservation, and I realized then that this box, ignored for so long, contained a continuity the public story lacked, a through line that connected struggle to outcome without skipping steps. And when I finished, I sat back on the floor surrounded by images that no longer belonged only to me. And I understood that this was the turning point, not because the world would suddenly care, but because I now had the means to speak without raising my voice, and that is a power people underestimate, because silence backed by proof is not passive. It's strategic, and before I allowed doubt to creep in, before the old instinct to protect her at my own expense could resurface, I opened my laptop and began writing messages, not emotional appeals, not accusations, but brief introductions accompanied by attachments, sent to people whose interests were tied directly to the story being told, sponsors and partners and organizations that had built campaigns around resilience and honesty. And I kept the language neutral, factual, because outrage invites dismissal while facts invite scrutiny. And when I finished and hit send once, then again, I felt the peculiar calm that comes after a decision you've delayed for too long, because whatever happened next would no longer be controlled by fear, and the waiting that followed was different from any waiting I'd known before. Because it wasn't empty, it was charged, each hour heavy with possibility, and when the first response arrived, it was not dramatic, just a request for clarification, a polite question that confirmed what I already knew. Someone was paying attention, and from there the pace quickened quietly, not with headlines, but with messages and calls and forwarded screenshots, pieces moving behind the scenes as people verified and cross-checked and whispered. And I watched from the sidelines, not interfering, not explaining more than necessary, because this was not my performance, it was the truth finding its own footing. And then something happened that none of us had planned for. Something that shifted the balance entirely, because proof doesn't always come from the places you expect. And while my documentation built pressure slowly, another form of evidence surfaced abruptly, carried not by intention but by habit. By a neighbor across the street who had installed a camera years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with me. And when that footage found its way into the open, capturing the moment I had tried so hard to minimize in my own mind, the shove, the fall, the indifference that followed, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Because people can debate stories endlessly, but they respond instinctively to motion, to cruelty caught unguarded. And as that clip spread, stripped of context and then buried under commentary, the narrative began to fracture in real time. Sponsors issued statements full of careful language, partners paused collaborations pending review, and the silence from my daughter grew heavier by the hour, because silence after exposure is not the same as silence before. And I sat at my kitchen table watching it unfold, not celebrating, not grieving, just observing with a steadiness that surprised me, because this was never about watching her fall, it was about watching the lie lose its balance. And when the messages shifted from curiosity to apology, from questions to acknowledgments, I knew the point of no return had been crossed, not because the world had chosen me, but because the evidence had removed the option to ignore me. And that distinction mattered because being seen out of pity is fleeting, but being seen because the truth insists on it is permanent. And as night settled and the house grew quiet again, I realized the strangest part of all was how little I wanted to say now, how complete the silence felt, because I had finally placed the story where it belonged, outside of myself. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, one thought remained, clear and unresolved, because exposure answers some questions but creates others, and the next one was unavoidable. If the woman who replaced me could vanish so easily once the truth emerged, then what would my daughter do when she realized she was left alone with the story she had built, and no one else left to carry it for her? When the world finally noticed, it didn't arrive with understanding or nuance. It arrived like weather, sudden and indiscriminate, because once a story tips in the public eye, it no longer belongs to the people who lived it. It belongs to everyone who feels entitled to react. and I watched that shift happen not from a place of triumph, but from a distance that felt almost clinical. Because there is a strange relief in no longer being the one who has to explain, and the first signs were small articles quietly updated, headlines softened with the word alleged. Corporate statements drafted in careful tones that tried to separate values from individuals. But even in those early movements, I could feel the momentum building, because reputations built on narrative are fragile. And once doubt enters the frame, it multiplies faster than loyalty. And the video, the one captured by chance and shared without permission, became the axis everything turned on, because it showed what words never could. Not just the shove, but the decision not to look back, the absence of hesitation, and people reacted to that absence more than anything else, because it revealed a truth no apology could undo. And as the clip spread, the responses shifted from curiosity to anger, from confusion to moral certainty, and the comments grew sharper by the hour. Not because people cared about me personally, but because they recognized betrayal in a form they understood, and recognition breeds outrage. And with outrage came consequences, swift and measurable, sponsors withdrawing support, partnerships dissolving overnight, statements about integrity and alignment flooding inboxes that had once celebrated her vision. And I learned then how quickly admiration can invert itself when it realizes it has been misled. Because belief, once broken, seeks something to punish, and the story expanded beyond me, beyond our family, into a broader indictment of manufactured authenticity. And in that expansion, my daughter disappeared entirely. Not physically at first, but rhetorically, her name fading from promotional materials, her face replaced by neutral logos, her voice absent from the spaces it once dominated, and that silence spoke louder than any defense could have. Because people read it as avoidance, as guilt, as calculation, and the more she withdrew, the more the narrative hardened around her absence. And through it all, I remained quiet, declining interviews, ignoring requests for comment. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood something crucial. My words were no longer necessary, and when truth reaches a certain velocity, additional testimony only muddies it, and that restraint unsettled people, because they wanted a villain who would gloat or a victim who would beg, and I was neither. I was simply present, and presence, I discovered, is unsettling when it refuses to perform. And as the days passed, new details surfaced without my involvement: financial discrepancies, internal emails, accounts from former employees who had felt something was wrong but lacked proof until now, and each revelation stacked neatly on top of the last, not dramatic on its own, but devastating in accumulation. And the woman who had replaced me vanished first, her name scrubbed from websites, her images quietly removed, a disappearance so complete it felt rehearsed. And when the news finally broke that funds linked to the foundation had been drained and rooted elsewhere, the reaction shifted again, because betrayal of family can be debated, but betrayal of donors is not tolerated. And that was the moment the story stopped being about identity and became about accountability. And through all of it, I felt a strange detachment, not because I didn't care, but because caring had already done its damage. And now observation felt safer, steadier. And when I thought of my daughter during those days, it wasn't with anger or satisfaction, but with a heavy understanding, because she had built her success on absence, on the idea that no one would ever challenge the version of events she presented, and now that absence had collapsed, leaving her alone with choices she could no longer outsource. And late one night, as I sat by the window listening to the quiet hum of a world that had already moved on to the next outrage, I received a message from someone who had worked closely with her from the beginning, a short note sent without a name, thanking me for speaking without speaking, for reminding them what honesty actually costs. And that message stayed with me, because it reframed the chaos not as destruction but as correction, and corrections, though painful, are necessary when systems reward performance over truth. And as I folded that thought into the silence around me, I realized the most difficult moment had yet to come, because exposure changes the world's perception. But it doesn't answer the most personal question of all, the one that waits quietly beneath every public scandal. What happens when the person who erased you finally needs you again, and there was no avoiding it now, because the phone would ring eventually, and when it did, it wouldn't be the world calling, it would be my daughter, and that call, I knew with certainty, would demand a decision no evidence could make for me. The call came in the quiet hours, the kind of hour when the world feels unfinished and even bad news sounds smaller because everything else is asleep, and I knew who it was before I answered. Not because of the number, but because my body recognized the moment, the way it had learned to recognize storms long before the first drop fell. And when I lifted the phone, there was a pause on the other end. A breath taken and released too carefully, and then my name, spoken without confidence, without authority, stripped of the polish I had heard so often on stages and screens, and for the first time in years she sounded young again. Not powerful, not convincing, just uncertain, and she began with apologies that felt assembled rather than felt, words stacked on top of each other as if volume could make them sincere, telling me things had spiraled, that people had turned, that accounts were frozen and lawyers were calling and boards were dissolving. And as she spoke, I noticed how quickly she framed herself as overwhelmed rather than responsible, how easily fear rearranged the story once more. And I listened without interrupting, because listening costs nothing and reveals everything. And eventually she arrived at the reason for the call, though she circled it first, hinting at consequences, at urgency, at how unfair everything felt. Before finally asking the question she had clearly rehearsed but could not soften enough to hide its meaning, asking whether I could help, whether I could step in quietly, whether I had resources that might stabilize things until the noise died down. And when she said it, I felt the weight of years pressed gently but firmly against my chest, not anger, not triumph, just recognition. Because this was the moment she had always assumed would exist, the moment when consequences could be deferred by the same person who had absorbed every earlier cost, and I looked out the window at the small tree in the yard. Its branches steady in the dark, grown from something that had once been thrown away, and I realized then that the choice in front of me had nothing to do with money or forgiveness or even justice. It had to do with pattern, with whether I would continue to absorb impact so she could avoid learning how to stand on her own. And when I finally spoke, my voice surprised me with its calm. Because calm is what arrives when a decision has already been made somewhere deeper. And I told her I remembered the day she called me a liability, the way she had said it as if it explained everything, and she went quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't listening but bracing, and I told her that liabilities are removed to protect the system, not nurtured, not defended, and that systems built on removal eventually remove everyone. And she tried to interrupt then, tried to remind me of history, of sacrifice, of what she once wrote and believed, but belief, I had learned, does not excuse behavior, it explains it at best. And I told her something I had never said aloud before, that I had loved her enough to disappear when she needed a story more than a mother, and that love did not obligate me to save her from the consequences of that choice. And the silence that followed was long and heavy, punctuated by breathing that sounded too close to breaking. And for a moment I almost reached back, almost softened the boundary, because habits don't vanish easily, especially ones shaped by survival. But then she asked again, this time smaller, asking if I would at least talk to someone on her behalf, at least vouch for her intentions, and that was when I understood the true cost of the moment. Because vouching would mean lying again, quietly, politely, the way lies prefer to be told, and I told her no, not harshly, not dramatically, just no, because no was the only honest answer left. And when she asked why, I told her the truth that had taken me decades to learn, that help offered too early becomes a crutch, and crutches prevent healing. And I told her that if she wanted to rebuild, she would have to do it without rewriting anyone else's past, including mine. And there was a sound on the other end then, something between a sob and a laugh, the sound of a story realizing it no longer controls the ending. And when the call finally ended, not with resolution but with exhaustion, I sat there longer than necessary, phone still warm in my hand, because endings rarely arrive cleanly. And what surprised me most was not the ache that followed but the relief. Because for the first time I had not traded my stability for her comfort, and that restraint felt like growth, quiet and uncelebrated. And as I turned off the lamp and let the room return to darkness, one thought remained, steady and unresolved, because refusal closes one door but opens another. And the question that lingered was not whether she would survive without me, but whether I would finally allow myself to live without waiting for her to come back. Life didn't surge forward after that call, it settled, the way dust does after something heavy has finally stopped moving. And in that stillness, I learned the difference between an ending and a return. Because what followed wasn't closure in the dramatic sense. There were no apologies broadcast to the world, no reconciliation staged for redemption, only a quiet reordering of days that no longer revolved around waiting. And I began to notice how much energy had been spent anticipating her next move, her next need, her next version of the past. And without that anticipation, my mornings stretched open, unclaimed, and I filled them slowly, deliberately. watering the small garden behind the house, checking the soil the way you check your own pulse after a long illness, just to confirm that you're still here, and the tree I had planted from a discarded seed grew sturdier each season. Its branches uneven but persistent, and it became a marker of time, of patience rewarded not with applause but with fruit, and neighbors began to notice it before they noticed me, asking what kind it was, how long it took to bear. And I answered simply, because simplicity had returned to my life as a relief rather than a lack, and occasionally news about her reached me secondhand, filtered through headlines that no longer carried reverence. Descriptions of rebuilding and reflection written in careful language that avoided ownership, and I didn't seek those stories out or turn away from them. I let them pass through like weather, because her journey was no longer mine to manage. And the most unexpected gift of that realization was peace, not the absence of pain, but the absence of urgency, because urgency is what keeps wounds open, demanding constant attention, and without it, healing finds its own pace. And I began to volunteer again, serving meals at the community center where no one knew my history and no one needed to, because usefulness doesn't require recognition. And there was a little girl next door who liked to ask questions about the birds and the plants, who called me by a name I hadn't chosen but didn't correct. And when she sat on my steps eating an orange and asked how something so small could grow into something that strong, I told her the truth that had taken me a lifetime to understand, that growth happens underground first, where no one is watching, and that answer felt complete, because it was no longer meant to convince anyone, only to be true. And sometimes in the evenings, I wrote a few sentences in a notebook I never intended to share. Reflections without audience, words that didn't need to perform or persuade, and that writing felt different from everything I had done before, because it belonged to me alone. And when people knocked on my door, it was not to ask for statements or interviews, but to bring bread or fruit, or simply to sit for a while. And those moments reminded me that being seen doesn't always look like being spotlighted. Sometimes it looks like being chosen quietly, and I thought often about what had been taken and what had been given back, about how easily stories can erase those who carry them, and how stubbornly truth survives when it's rooted in lived experience. And I realized that the story I had feared being forgotten had in fact transformed. No longer about betrayal or exposure, but about continuity, about what remains after everything performative has fallen away. And the most important truth of all arrived without announcement, settling gently into my days. I had not lost my role as a mother. I had released the need for my child to confirm it, and that release freed something essential, because love that demands recognition eventually collapses under its own weight, while love that chooses distance can endure. And as seasons changed and the tree continued to grow, I understood that this story had never been about revenge or victory. It had been about roots, about the quiet strength that holds even when cut from view. And if anyone ever asks me how I survived being erased, I tell them I didn't fight to be rewritten. I kept living until the truth caught up on its own, and that truth, once it arrived, didn't restore the past or guarantee the future, but it gave me something far more lasting. The freedom to continue without apology, grounded in what was real, steady in what remains, and certain of this, that a mother's presence does not vanish just because someone tries to replace it. It lingers in habits, in hands that know how to tend what's growing, and in a life lived honestly long after the cameras have turned away.